My name is Nina Reeves. I'm 44 years old. And 22 years ago, while I was unconscious in a hospital bed, my family signed papers giving away my daughter. They told me she hadn't survived. I believed them for 22 years. I need to start at the beginning because the beginning is the only way to understand how something like this becomes possible. How a family arrives at a decision that monstrous and finds a way to believe, collectively, that they had no. I was 22 years old when I got pregnant. The father was a man named Kevin who I had been seeing for 8 months, not a relationship with a future. Both of us understood that, but a real one for what it was. When I told him I was pregnant, he was honest. He wasn't ready to be a father. He would support whatever decision I made, but he was not going to be a primary parent. I decided to keep the baby. My family, my mother Ellen, my father Richard, and my older sister Gwen, did not receive this news well. Not because they didn't love me, but because their version of my future did not include a baby at 22 with a man who wasn't going to stay. They were practical people, my family, the kind of people who approach problems by identifying the cleanest solution and moving toward it. A single mother at 22 in their framework was not the cleanest. They said all the things families say, that I was too young, that I didn't understand what I was taking on, that there were other options. I heard all of it and I made my decision and I told them I was keeping the baby and they eventually, reluctantly, accepted it in the way that families accept decisions they disagree with outwardly, while reserving their own judgment privately. My pregnancy was uncomplicated until the 34th week. I had been experiencing headaches for 2 weeks that I mentioned to my OB, who monitored my blood pressure and scheduled additional appointments. The headaches intensified. On a Thursday evening in November, I called my mother because I was scared, and she drove me to the hospital where I was diagnosed with severe preeclampsia and admitted immediately. What happened in the following hours I know only from medical records and from accounts given to me years later, because I was not conscious for most of it. My condition deteriorated rapidly. My daughter was delivered by emergency cesarean at 34 weeks, small but alive, breathing on her own within hours of delivery, transferred to the NICU with the particular resilience of premature babies who surprise everyone. The delivery triggered a cascade of complications in me, eclamptic seizures, followed by a hemorrhagic stroke that left me in a medically induced coma for 11 days. My daughter was alive. I was unconscious. My family was in the hospital, watching both of us, making decisions about both of us. The decision they made about my daughter happened on day 5 of my coma. I want to be precise about what I know and what I have had to reconstruct, because the full picture took years to assemble, and I want to be honest about the seams. What I know is that my mother signed consent forms on day 5 authorizing the placement of my daughter, whom I had not yet named, whom I had not yet held with an adoption agency. What I know is that my father and Gwen were both present at the hospital during this period, and that neither of them stopped it. What I know is that when I woke up on day 11 and asked about my baby, my mother told me she had not survived. What I know is that this was a lie. What I did not know for 22 years was that my daughter was alive, that she had left the NICU after 3 weeks healthy and small, and had gone to a family in Ohio, that she had grown up loved by all accounts, by parents who had told her from an early age that she was adopted. That she had at 18, registered with an adoption reunion registry. That she had at 21, obtained her original birth certificate through Ohio's open records law, which allowed adult adoptees access to their original documents. That original birth certificate had my name on it. She found me through a combination of the registry, a DNA testing service, and the particular determination of a 22-year-old who had decided she wanted to know where she sent me a message through a genealogy website on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sitting at my kitchen table with coffee, reading emails, doing nothing that prepared me for what I was about to open. The message said, "I think you might be my biological mother. My name is Maya. I was born in November in a hospital in Western Pennsylvania. I have your name on my original birth certificate. I understand if you don't want to respond, but I needed to try." Then I called my mother. I want to describe that phone call carefully because it is the center of everything. My mother answered on the second ring. I told her I had received a message from a young woman who believed she was my biological daughter. I told her the woman's name was Maya and she had been born in November 22 years ago in Western Pennsylvania. My mother was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Nina, I can explain." Those 3 words, not a denial, not confusion, not the response of someone who was hearing impossible information, those 3 words told me everything before she said another word. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time. Then I responded to Maya. I told her I believed she was my daughter. I told her I had been told she had not survived. I told her I had not known she was alive, not for a single day of the 22 years since her birth, and that receiving her message was the most significant moment of my adult life. I asked her if she would be willing to talk. She called me that evening. Her voice was careful and warm in the way of someone who has prepared themselves for multiple possible outcomes and is genuinely uncertain which one they're in. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about her life, her adoptive parents who were good people and whom she loved, her childhood in Ohio, her decision to search, the years of registry and DNA testing and document requests that had finally led her to my name. I told her about the coma, about waking up and being told she was gone, about the grief that had shaped the years that followed, not loudly, not in a way that I had ever fully processed or named, but persistently, a low-frequency loss that I had learned to carry without examining too closely. She cried, I cried, we made plans to meet. What I had not yet done in those first weeks of communication with Maya was fully reckon with what my family had done. I want to be honest about why. The joy of finding Maya, of knowing she was alive, of hearing her voice, of beginning to know her was so overwhelming in those first weeks that the anger hadn't yet found its full shape. I knew what had happened. I knew what my mother had done. But I was also simultaneously in the most extraordinary experience of my life, and the two things existed side by side in a way that made clear thinking difficult. The thinking clarified when Maya and I met in person for the first time, at a hotel in Pittsburgh, a city that was equidistant between us and that neither of us had any particular attachment to, which felt right. She was 22 years old and she looked like me around the eyes, and she ordered her coffee the same way I did without knowing it, and we sat across from each other and talked for 4 hours, and by the end I was clearer than I had been about anything in years. What my family had taken from me was not just the decision. It was 22 years. 22 years of a person's life, first steps and first words in school and friendships and heartbreaks and growth, and all of the ordinary, extraordinary texture of a human being becoming themselves. 22 years I had spent grieving someone I was told was gone. What they had taken from Maya was the knowledge of where she came from, for 22 years during which she had wondered and registered and searched and waited. On the drive back from Pittsburgh, I called a family law attorney. Her name was Rachel Kim, and she had been recommended by a friend who had been through an adoption-related legal matter of a different kind. I described the situation to Rachel in as much detail as I had at that point, the coma, the consent forms, the lie, the 22 years. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The consent forms your mother signed while you were in a coma, were you ever formally declared legally incapacitated?" I said I didn't know. She said that was the first thing we needed to establish. Because if there was no formal legal declaration of incapacity, if my mother had signed those consent forms as a self-appointed decision-maker without legal authority to do so, then the adoption might have been executed without valid consent from the biological mother. I pulled my medical records from that hospitalization. They confirmed what Rachel had suspected. I had been in a medically induced coma, which is a clinical state, not a legal declaration of incapacity. No court had declared me legally unable to manage my own affairs. No guardian had been appointed. My mother had signed the consent forms as my mother, not as my legal guardian. The adoption agency had accepted those forms. Rachel said this was not unheard of in 2002, when oversight of such processes was less rigorous in certain states than it would later become. She said it did not mean the adoption itself was necessarily reversible. Maya had been raised for 22 years by parents who had adopted her in good faith, but it did mean that the consent had been legally questionable from the beginning. It also meant that what my mother had done potentially constituted fraud. I sat with that word for a long time. The legal matter that followed was not a challenge to Maya's adoption, neither she nor I wanted that. Her parents were her parents. That was not something I had any interest in undoing. What I filed with Rachel's guidance was a civil complaint against my mother for fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and wrongful interference with parental rights. The case took 14 months. My mother's defense, presented through her attorney, was that she had acted in what she believed to be my best interest, that I had been critically ill, that no one had known whether I would recover or to what degree, that she had believed a premature infant required stable, immediate placement, and that she had made the best decision available to her under impossible circumstances. She also said, through her attorney, that she had not known how to tell me the truth when I woke up, that the lie had started as something she told herself was temporary, she would tell me later when I was stronger, and had become something she could not find her way out of. I believe this is true. I believe my mother told herself a story about a temporary mercy that became a permanent cage she built herself into year by year, each year making the next year's disclosure harder, until 22 years had passed and the story had its own structural integrity that felt impossible to dismantle. I believe this, and I also believe it doesn't matter. The harm is not diminished by the intention. The 22 years are not returned by the explanation. The case settled. My mother paid a significant sum in damages, enough to be meaningful, not enough to undo anything. She was required to provide a formal written acknowledgement of what she had done. Gwen, who had been present and had said nothing, settled a separate claim. My father had died 4 years earlier. I do not know and will never know what he would have done differently. My mother and I do not have a relationship. This is my choice, made clearly and without anger that surprised me with how clean it was. I do not hate her. I understand a level I did not expect to reach, how she arrived at her decision and how she stayed inside it for 22 years. But understanding how someone causes harm does not obligate you to remain in relationship with them, and the harm she caused was the kind that does not leave room in me for what a relationship would require. Meyer and I. She came to stay with me for a week last summer and we cooked together and watched old movies, and she fell asleep on my couch on the third evening, and I sat in the chair across from her and looked at her for a long time. She is 22 years old and she is alive and I know her name. That is the whole of what I have needed every day since March to get up and move forward. I am 44 years old. I lost 22 years to a lie told by someone who loved me and could not find a way to tell me the truth. I have the next 22, and I intend to use every single one. There is something I want to add that I held back from the main telling, something about Maya that I think matters more than any of the legal details. When we met in Pittsburgh about an hour into our conversation, Meyer asked me something I hadn't anticipated. She asked me what I would. I had chosen a name before she was born. I had been certain by month 7 that I was having a girl, and I had chosen the name carefully, Lily, after my grandmother who had died the year before and whose steadiness I had always wanted to carry forward into something. I told Maya. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My middle name is Lillian." Her adoptive parents had named her Maya Lillian. They had not known my grandmother's name. They had not known. They had simply chosen a name they loved. I don't know what to do with that coincidence except to hold it. I have turned it over many times in the months since, trying to decide what it means or whether it means anything at all. I am not a superstitious person. I am not someone who finds patterns in randomness and calls them signs. But I think about it. The name I chose, and the name that found her anyway by a different path, through people who didn't know they were completing something I had started. There are other things I have learned about Meyer in the months since our first meeting that I want to say here because they matter to the full picture. She is a nurse. She decided at 19. She told me that she wanted to work in neonatal care. She wanted to be in the unit where premature babies went, where small lives were given time to become larger ones. She didn't connect this to her own birth story until later, until she started searching and learned that she had been premature herself, that she had spent 3 weeks in a NICU in Pennsylvania being tended by people whose names she would never know. She is, by every account I have received, extraordinary at the work. I think about the 34 weeks, about the hospital in Western Pennsylvania, about the nurses who cared for her in those 3 weeks before she was placed with her family, about the fact that she grew up to become one of them, to become, by the particular alchemy of who she is and what she chose, the person who would have been there for her if she had been born now, in a different version of the same story. I told her once that I thought there was something significant in that. She laughed and said she had probably just seen too many medical dramas as a child. But she also said that when she worked with premature babies and their families, she thought about her own beginning, about the uncertainty of those early weeks, about the parents who sat beside incubators and hoped, and that it made her more present to the families in her care. She is 22 years old and I did not make her that. Her parents made her that, and she made herself that, and the particular combination of choices and circumstances and loves that constituted her life before March made her into the person who sent me a careful, considerate message on a genealogy website and waited to see if I would respond. What I gave her was a name she never received, and a biology she spent 22 years wondering about, and 22 years of grief that was, I now understand, grief for her, grief I did not know how to name because I had been told she was gone. What she gave me by finding me was the understanding that the grief had been real, that the loss had been real, that something had happened that should not have happened, and that the fact of her existence, alive, accomplished, curious, warm, ordering her coffee with oat milk and no sugar just like me, was not a consolation for what was taken but was something separate and whole and entirely its own. I have spent time in the months since thinking about my mother and the moment she made her decision. Day 5 of my coma. The forms on a desk. A premature infant in a NICU down the hall. A daughter unconscious in another room who might recover diminished, who was 22 years old and unmarried and had chosen a path that the family had not endorsed. I have tried to reconstruct what it felt like to be my mother in that moment. The fear, the practical urgency, the belief, perhaps sincere, that she was solving a problem before it became unsolvable. I have tried and I have come to the same place every time. She did not ask me. That is not the decision itself. People make terrible decisions under impossible circumstances, and I have enough compassion left to believe that she believed, in some version of her own reasoning, that she was acting in my interest. But she did not ask me. She did not wait. She did not treat the decision as one that belonged to me, even in my absence, even in my unconsciousness. She treated it as hers to make. And 22 years later, a young woman with my eyes and my grandmother's name in her name sent me a message on a website, and I understood for the first time the full cost of that decision. It cost me 22 years of a person I would have loved immediately and completely and without condition. It cost Maya 22 years of knowing where she came from. It cost my mother, in the end, the relationship with the daughter she had been trying to protect. None of those costs were necessary. None of them were inevitable. They were the consequence of one person deciding, in a moment of fear and exhaustion and perhaps love, that she had the right to make a choice that was not hers to make. I am 44 years old. I have a daughter who is 22 and who calls me on Sunday evenings and who is a neonatal nurse in Ohio and whose middle name is Lillian. I lost 22 years. I have the next 22. And I will not waste a single one of them being anything other than present for what I have now.